The entrance to the cavern yawned before them, a jagged, pulsating maw in the alien landscape. The material around it was unmistakably organic, shimmering like damp flesh under the dim light of Erebus III's sickly auroras. Every step toward it filled the air with a low vibration, a resonance felt deep in their bones. Rian Voss hesitated at the threshold, clutching the artifact in his hands. It hummed with an almost frantic energy now, the whispers in his mind rising to a crescendo, incoherent but insistent. He could feel its pull, an ancient compulsion that no longer felt entirely his own. Behind him, Captain Miera Jain tightened her grip on her plasma rifle, her jaw set. "This is a bad idea," she said, her voice low but sharp. "That thing's leading us straight into the heart of whatever killed those people." Rian glanced back, his expression hollow. "If we turn back now, we're dead anyway. You've seen what's happening to Goran. The answer's down here." They both turned to Goran Tay, slumped against a nearby rock, his breathing labored. Black tendrils veined his body, creeping up his neck and disappearing beneath the collar of his armor. His cybernetic arm twitched erratically, sparks dancing along its surface as if rejecting the infection. "Answer," Goran rasped, his voice a ragged growl. "Or tomb." Miera cursed under her breath, but she knew Rian was right. If they didn't find a way to stop whatever was inside Goran, none of them would leave this planet alive. Sana Kryn, the last remaining member of their team, stepped forward, her face pale beneath her helmet. "The spores in the air are getting denser," she said, studying her scanner. "This isn't just a hive, it's a living ecosystem. Everything here is connected to whatever's below." "That's comforting," Miera muttered, nodding toward the cavern. "Let's hope it's not hungry." The group descended into the darkness, their helmet lights cutting narrow beams through the suffocating gloom. The cavern walls glistened with a slick, membranous substance that shifted slightly when touched, as though alive. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with spores that danced like embers in the light. The first chamber they entered was vast and cathedral-like, its walls lined with grotesque formations that seemed half metal, half flesh. Strange bioluminescent veins pulsed across the ceiling, casting an eerie green light over the scene. At the center of the room stood a massive structure, a pillar-like growth covered in the twisted remains of alien and human corpses, their bodies fused into its surface like grotesque trophies. Rian approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized some of the faces. They were explorers, scavengers, researchers, people who had gone missing over the years, drawn to Erebus III by the same whispers that now haunted him. "This isn't just a hive," Sana whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a graveyard. It assimilates them." A sound echoed through the chamber, a low, wet slithering that sent shivers down their spines. Miera raised her weapon, scanning the darkness for movement. The sound grew louder, coming from all directions, as though the walls themselves were alive. And then they saw it. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. Its body was a writhing mass of tendrils, each one tipped with jagged, chitinous blades. Its head was elongated and eyeless, its mouth a gaping maw lined with needle-like teeth. As it moved, its tendrils brushed against the walls, fusing momentarily before detaching, as if it were part of the hive itself. The creature let out a guttural screech, and the chamber erupted into chaos. Miera opened fire, her plasma bolts striking the creature's tendrils, but barely slowing it down. The thing moved with a speed and agility that defied its size, dodging their attacks and retaliating with savage swipes. One of its tendrils lashed out, striking Goran in the chest and sending him sprawling. He roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he lunged forward, slamming his cybernetic fist into the creature's side. The blow connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature screeched in pain. But as Goran withdrew his arm, the tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him closer. He screamed as the black veins on his body surged, spreading across his face and into his eyes. The creature released him, and he crumpled to the ground, convulsing. "Goran!" Sana cried, rushing toward him, but Miera grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "He's gone," Miera yelled. "We have to keep moving." Rian, meanwhile, was drawn to the far side of the chamber, where the artifact's hum had grown almost unbearable. He found himself standing before a massive opening in the floor, a chasm that seemed to descend endlessly into the planet's core. At its edge, the walls were covered in more carvings, depicting the same monstrous creature they had seen before. But here, the images showed the artifact as well, held aloft by the alien figures in a ritualistic pose. "They used it to trap the Hive," Rian muttered, the realization hitting him like a blow. "This thing, it's not just a key, it's a prison." Behind him, the creature screeched again, its tendrils thrashing as it fought Miera and Sana. Miera's shots struck true this time, severing one of the tendrils, but the creature seemed to grow angrier, its movements more erratic. "We can't kill it," Sana shouted. "It's not just a creature, it's the Hive. Destroying it won't stop the infection. It'll spread." Ryan's mind raced. The carvings suggested the artifact could stop the Hive, but at a terrible cost. He glanced at Goran, now writhing on the ground, his body contorted and alien. He thought of the countless lives lost to this place, their bodies twisted and consumed by the Hive's relentless hunger. He had to act. "Cover me," Rian shouted, pulling the artifact from his pack. Its glow was blinding now, the whispers in his mind turning into a single deafening voice. "Rian, what are you doing?" Miera yelled, firing another shot at the creature. "It's the only way," he called back. "The artifact. It can destroy the Hive." Sana's eyes widened. "Destroy the Hive or unleash it?" "I don't know," Rian admitted, stepping closer to the chasm. The creature turned toward him, its eyeless face locking onto the artifact. It let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged, its tendrils reaching for him. Miera fired again, striking the creature in midair, but it was too late. The artifact pulsed violently, and Rian thrust it into the chasm. The reaction was immediate. A blinding light erupted from the chasm, engulfing the creature and the entire chamber. The walls trembled, the pulsating veins bursting and spilling a black, viscous fluid that evaporated on contact with the light. The creature let out a final, deafening scream before disintegrating, its body collapsing into the chasm. The ground shook violently, and Rian stumbled back, barely catching himself. Miera grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the exit as the cavern began to collapse. "Run!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar. The three of them, Rian, Miera, and Sana, stumbled out of the ruins just as the ground gave way, swallowing the Hive and its horrors into the depths of Erebus III. Rian collapsed onto the icy ground, gasping for breath, the whispers in his mind finally silent. But as they turned back to the ruins, a faint shimmer of spores drifted into the air, carried on the wind. It wasn't over. Not yet. The obsidian wraith lay cradled in the shattered remains of the ruins, its hull dented and blackened by the collapsing hive. The storm above raged on, thick clouds swirling with violet lightning, as if the planet itself were warning them to leave. But for Rian Voss, Captain Mira John, and Dr. Sana Kryn, there was no leaving. Not yet. The artifact was gone, but its destruction had not silenced the hive. It had awakened something worse. The spores had risen like ash from a dying flame, spreading across the planet's surface. They clung to their suits, their skin, their lungs. They were no longer explorers or survivors. They were carriers. Rian staggered to his feet, his hands trembling as he gripped the jagged edge of a collapsed wall for support. The whispers had returned, louder now, a deafening chorus of alien voices invading his mind. He knew it wasn't just him. He could see it in Mira's haunted expression, in the way Sana gripped her head as though trying to claw the sound out. "It didn't stop it," Mira said, her voice tight with rage and exhaustion. She leaned heavily on her rifle, her face pale beneath the grime. "The artifact. It didn't kill the hive, it just changed it." "It's not the hive anymore," Sana muttered, her eyes distant. She was staring at the horizon where the faint outline of black tendrils snaked upward into the atmosphere. "It's becoming something else. It's spreading, Rian. If it leaves this planet..." "It won't," Rian interrupted, his voice firm despite the fear that gnawed at his core. "We can't let it." The three of them retreated to the obsidian wraith and sealed the hatch behind them. Inside, the hum of the ship's life support systems felt thin and fragile, a faint barrier against the nightmare pressing in from every direction. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. Rian sat heavily at the navigation console, staring at the ship's damaged readouts. "We don't have enough power to leave orbit," Mira said, pacing the cramped cockpit. "The reactor's shot, half the systems are fried, and the spore contamination..." She trailed off, her eyes drifting to Goran's empty seat. The mercenaries' absence was a gaping wound in their already fractured crew. "Even if we could leave," Sana said softly, her voice tinged with resignation, "we'd just take it with us. The spores are inside us now. The scans confirmed it." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. None of them spoke for a long moment. The implications were clear. If they left Erebus 3, they would doom the galaxy. Rian closed his eyes, his thoughts racing. The whispers had become clearer now, as if the hive, or whatever it had become, was speaking directly to him. Images flickered through his mind, planets consumed by black tendrils, stars eclipsed by organic spires, countless lives twisted into grotesque forms. The hive wasn't just growing, it was evolving, becoming something unstoppable. "There's one way," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira stopped pacing and turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Rian looked up, meeting her gaze. "The reactor. If we overload it, we can trigger a detonation big enough to vaporize the hive. The whole planet." "You're insane," Mira snapped. "That would kill us too." Rian nodded slowly. "It's the only way. The artifact was a prison, not a weapon. It was never meant to destroy the hive, just contain it. But we don't have that option anymore." Sana stared at him, her expression torn between fear and understanding. "Ryan, if we do this, there's no coming back." "There's nothing to come back to," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "If we let this thing spread, it'll destroy everything." The preparations were grim and methodical. Ryan worked silently at the reactor, bypassing the ship's safety protocols and inputting the override codes to trigger an overload. The reactor core pulsed with an angry red light, casting long shadows across the cramped engineering bay. Miera stood watch near the cockpit, her weapon drawn, though she knew it was useless. The spores had begun to infiltrate the ship itself, creeping along the walls like a living infection. Every so often, she thought she saw movement in the shadows, twisted shapes that weren't there when she looked again. Sana sat nearby, her hands trembling as she ran a final diagnostic on the reactor. Her lips moved silently, reciting a prayer in a language Rian didn't recognize. As the final sequence initialized, Miera spoke. "We still have a choice," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We could send a distress signal, warn the galaxy, maybe someone else." "No one else can stop it," Ryan interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "You saw what it did to Goran, to those ruins. If it spreads, there won't be anyone left to fight it." Miera clenched her fists, her frustration palpable. But she didn't argue. The final moments were a blur of alarms and flashing lights. The reactor's countdown echoed through the ship, a mechanical voice intoning their imminent demise. 10 minutes to critical overload. Ryan sat at the console, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. He glanced at Miera and Sana, their faces illuminated by the red glow of the emergency lights. For all their differences, they were united now by a single, terrible purpose. 5 minutes to critical overload. Sana broke the silence. "Do you think anyone will know what we did? That we stopped it?" Ryan smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe it's better if no one ever knows." The ship shuddered violently, and the walls began to buckle as the spores breached the hull. The air was thick with their presence, an almost suffocating pressure that seemed to bear down on them. The whispers grew louder, a final cacophony of rage and desperation. 2 minutes to critical overload. Miera leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. "If I'd known this was how I'd go, I would have charged double." Ryan laughed softly, though it sounded more like a sob. "You should have charged triple." The countdown reached its final seconds. Ryan took one last look at the console, at the faint reflection of his own face in the cracked screen. He thought of the lives they were saving, the people who would never know how close they had come to annihilation. Critical overload in 3, 2, 1. The reactor erupted in a blinding light, consuming the obsidian wraith, the Hive, and the entire surface of Erebus 3. For a brief moment, the planet burned like a second star, its glow visible from the farthest reaches of the Andromeda galaxy. And then there was silence. In the vast emptiness of space, a faint shimmer of spores drifted, carried by the currents of the void. Somewhere, the whispers began again,